The following episode describes graphic details of deaths and injuries caused by fire. Listener discretion is advised. It's around 3 a.m. on Wednesday, July 11th, 1973. 60-year-old Alexander Shemeth is clinging for dear life from his fifth-story apartment window at 728 Main Street in Worcester. Five-alarm fire has quickly spread throughout the rooming house building in Worcester's Main South neighborhood. There's very little hope for escape for many of the tenants that live there. The deck is stacked against Alexander. As the Worcester fire ladder approaches, he calls out as loudly as he can for help as he climbs out of his window. He's hanging on the window ledge with hooks. The double amputee lost his hands in an accident more than 20 years ago. As firefighters are raising the ladder toward the fifth-floor window, Alexander's arms slip from their hooks, still hanging from the ledge. He falls 50 feet into an alleyway below and dies on impact. Days later, when the smoke is cleared, the death toll from Worcester's Deadliest fire would include Alexander and 9 other tenants.
Unsolved Worcester is brought to you by the following sponsors. Follow the crowd through the doors of Donut Homies and say hi to Haley Noel, the donut queen of Worcester's Canal District. Donut Homies is open inside the Worcester Public Market at 160 Green Street every Wednesday through Sunday at 11 a.m. Online ordering with delivery and pickup options is available at donuthomies.com. Follow Donut Homies on Facebook and Instagram for monthly menu drops, specials, and more. Donut Homies, everything sweeter with the homies.
Welcome back to Unsolved Worcester. I'm your host, Dan Yeager. Today's episode is part 1 of the 2-part episode special on the 50th anniversary of the 728 Main Street fire on July 11th, 1973. The deadliest fire in the city history killed 10 people, an early marker in Worcester's long and tragic history of devastating fires. In part 1, we will share the terrifying moments of the deadly blaze, including the frantic attempts to escape by the Main Street rooming house tenants and details on each of the 10 victims. Come back next week for part 2 as we focus on the arson investigation and indictments, safety and fire prevention measures taken by the city government to keep landlords accountable in the future, and an 11th victim the firewood claims years afterwards. Unsolved Worcester takes a deep dive every Tuesday into the unsolved murders and missing persons cases under investigation by the Worcester Police Department's Detective Unit. Our goal is to remind residents of the Worcester area, both past and present, that there are dozens of unsolved homicides and missing persons cases that need resolution. We hope we can be the spark needed to solve a case. Be sure to visit Unsolved Worcester on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and listen to all episodes for free at unsolvedworcester.com. and on your favorite podcast streaming platforms. Check out the video for this episode with exclusive aerial views and more on our Unsolved Worcester YouTube page. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. July 11th, 1973. It's described as the worst night ever in Worcester's Main South neighborhood. Just before 3 a.m., at the back of a rooming house at 728 Main Street, An arsonist set a fire on the second floor of the five-story building's wooden porch. The fire quickly spreads, engulfing the dozens of one-bedroom apartments and the tenants that live in them. The first alarm was received by the Worcester Fire Department at 2:59 a.m. By 3:15 a.m., 5 alarms have sounded. 45 minutes later, the fire is under control, but the reality of the tragedy and the devastation isn't yet fully realized. 10 tenants died in the fire. 23 people were injured. It's the deadliest fire in Worcester's history. And 50 years later, the arson and murder case remains unsolved. The writing was on the wall for Worcester. 1973 was a sure sign of things to come, for better or worse. The city's November municipal election saw city council seats awarded to 3 women and the largest turnover on the city council since the early 1950s. The mayor-elect, Israel Katz, had a son named Arnold, who, by the early 1980s, would become one of New England's most notorious organized crime leaders and the orchestrator of one of the largest drug rings in the country. Arnold Katz played an integral part of the disappearances of John V.J. Joyce Jr. and William Garlick in September 1982. We highlighted their missing persons case in Season 3 of Unsolved Worcester. And just before the 1973 holiday season, the longtime Denholmes department store on Main Street went bankrupt and closed. And months later, its sister store in the Auburn Mall would also shut its doors. But even with these momentous changes in Worcester, it would be a tragedy, the likes that have never been seen before or since in the city, that would constitute the most significant citywide changes for decades to come. 50 years ago, July 11th, 1973, a rear stairwell on the second floor back porch of a 5-story rooming house at 728 Main Street in Worcester's Main South neighborhood was purposefully set on fire. The rear of the building provided an escape for whoever set the fire, an alleyway toward Murray Avenue and 3 blocks further a busy Chandler Street. 54 tenants lived in the 50 rooms in the rooming house, each paid around $18.75 in weekly rent. There were no fire escapes on the building. Each room was equipped with a rope or chain ladder in case of fire. The building didn't have a sprinkler system. It would be another 6 months, January 1974, before a new state law would require rooming houses like the one at 728 Main Street to install sprinklers. The rooming house was owned by Leo Angers of Millbury, a landlord with more than 200 apartments and rooms in Main South. According to city records, the building had met all the necessary requirements and fire regulations in 1973 to be open. Following the tragic fire, whatever remained of the building was demolished. Built in 1894, the property, known as the Wardell Building, had been a rooming house for the better part of its more than 7 decades in existence. Today, the property is an additional parking lot for the Wonder Dollar discount store at 731 Main Street. In the months following the deadly fire, the city of Worcester would implement new fire regulations, building codes, and safety requirements in direct response to the tragedy that claimed 10 lives. We will highlight those changes in next week's Part 2 of our episode on the 50th anniversary of the 728 Main Street fire. Coming up, we identify the 10 victims who they were, and how they met their unfortunate end. Just over an hour after the fire started, around 4 a.m. on July 11th, 1973, the south side of the fifth floor of the five-story rooming house at 728 Main Street collapsed. The devastation could have been much worse, but the handful of tenants still on the fifth floor had likely already died from suffocation. Fifth floor tenant, 60-year-old Alexander Shemeth, nearly escaped death. The double amputee plummeted to his death from this fifth floor window, trying to escape a five-alarm fire at 728 Main Street after the hooks he used for hands failed him when he needed them most. Alexander lost both his hands in 1952 after a dynamite cap exploded inside a cottage in Charlton. While he had lost his hands, Alexander's hooks still allowed him to work as a torch operator at the former B. Bloomfield Company on Cambridge Street in Worcester. Among the 10 people that died in the fire, Alexander was one of just 2 victims to die outside of the building. The other was 70-year-old Joseph Person, who died hours after the fire, around 9:15 p.m. at the former City Hospital from heart failure after being admitted for smoke inhalation. Person was among the fire's older victims, the other being 70-year-old Alden Cathan, who had only been living at 728 Main Street for a short time. Alden had retired just 4 years before the fire in 1969 after spending 15 years as an orderly at Worcester State Hospital. He was born in Brimfield and lived in Worcester for 25 years of his life. He was a U.S. Navy veteran in World War II. When he died, he left behind 2 daughters and 10 grandchildren. Alden's body was found in his third-floor apartment. On the other end of the age spectrum was 18-year-old Karen Hardison, who, like Alexander Shemeth, lived on the 5th floor of the rooming house. Karen and Alexander are 2 of the 6 victims that lived on the 5th floor, among which was also Karen's boyfriend, 26-year-old Thomas Nichols. The young couple had only been living in Worcester for about 6 months. Thomas worked construction. He and Karen were both from Maine. Karen had just graduated from Caribou High School less than 2 months before. 53-year-old Walter Perkins also lived on the 5th floor. Like Alden Cathan, Walter was a World War II veteran in the U.S. Army. Walter was born and raised in the Laurel Clayton section of the city, now Worcester's Plumley Village. He was retired for 20 years before his death. He worked as a hat blocker for 30 years at the former Paul's Hat Shop. Walter left a daughter and 2 grandchildren when he died. He also outlived his father, Henry, a porter at the Eden Gardens restaurant in downtown Worcester for 40 years. The July 11th, 1973 fire wasn't the first fatal fire Walter had witnessed. Almost exactly 2 years before, Walter had escaped by a chain ladder from the window of his apartment on 5 Irving Street. That fire killed 4 tenants. The 5th victim found on the 5th floor after the fire at 728 Main Street was 44-year-old Daniel Hampton, Korean War veteran and a maintenance worker at Allied Maintenance Corporation in Worcester. Daniel was also born in Worcester. When he died, he left behind his father, stepmother, 3 brothers, 2 sisters, and 2 stepbrothers. Walter Perkins and Daniel Hampton are both buried at Hope Cemetery. Coming up, the search continues for victims of the 728 Main Street fire. Around 8 a.m. the day after the fire, July 12, 1973, two more bodies were discovered in the rubble of 728 Main Street and recovered by firefighters using an aerial ladder. 54-year-old Helen Warren had lived in Worcester for a long time. She'd grown up in nearby West Upton. Helen had died of suffocation. Her body was found near a window in her fourth-floor apartment. Helen is buried at Notre Dame Cemetery. 66-year-old Francis Breen's body was found in the middle of his third-floor apartment. He had also suffocated. Francis was born in Worcester. He retired from the American Supply Company of Worcester and was a U.S. Navy veteran of World War II. When he died, Francis left 3 sisters. He is buried at St. John's Cemetery. It would be 3 days following the fire, as workers pulled the rubble away brick by brick, that the 10th victim would be discovered. 5th-floor resident, 56-year-old John Lund's body was found underneath it all. For reasons unknown, John was in the building's basement when the fire broke out. John's body was found around 11 a.m. on July 15, 1973. It took workers more than 3 hours to recover the body from the rubble. John was pronounced dead at City Hospital. The cause of death was asphyxiation and a crushed chest. John was a brick mason at American Steel and Wire, which would later change its name to Worcester Works. He was born in Worcester and was a World War II veteran with the U.S. Army. At the time of his death, John left his mother, 3 sons, 2 daughters, and a sister. He is buried at All Faiths Cemetery on Island Road in Worcester. In the first week after the fire, 2 other residents of the rooming house, 60-year-old Michael Ruziski and 38-year-old Olivine Moxley, remained in the hospital in critical condition. In all, the fire at 728 Main Street on July 11, 1973, claimed the lives of 10 people and caused injuries to 29 people, including 15 rooming house tenants and 14 firefighters. Within a month following Worcester's Deadliest fire on July 11, 1973, fire and police officials promised a break in the arson investigation, and they reported there were 2 strong leads. They expected a break in the case by mid-August 1973 at the latest. The first month, more than 30 people were questioned and interviewed in connection with the case, and there were suspicions that the fire may have been set by juveniles. In fact, the head of the investigation was Captain Anthony Francis, the commander of Worcester Police Department's Juvenile Division. By August 8, 1973, investigators thought they had made a connection between the fire at 728 Main Street to 3 other fires set on August 6th in 1973 in Maine South. The 3 fires were all set at the bottom of rear stairwells, the same way the fatal fire at 728 Main Street was started. But by September 1973, the investigation was still ongoing, and police were still working around the clock in hopes of making a break in the arson case. It wouldn't be until late 1974, roughly a year and a half after Worcester's worst fire, that charges would be filed against 2 suspects. Come back next week as we explore the investigation into the July 11th, 1973 fire and the many changes made to Worcester's building code and fire and safety regulations as a result of the fire. Thank you for listening. I'm Dan Yeager. Don't miss another episode. Click the notification button to get alerts when new episodes of Unsolved Worcester drop. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please consider clicking the like button for us. And if you subscribe, the next episodes will show up in your feed. Click the bell on the right and select all, and you'll get a notification of when the next episode is ready. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, please leave them in the comments below. We do read them all and respond to as many as we can. Anyone with information are asked to contact the Worcester Police Detective Bureau at 508-799-8651 or send an anonymous text at 274-637. Write TIP WPD plus your message, or send an anonymous web-based message at worcesterma.gov/police. Come back on July 18th as Unsolved Worcester Season 5 continues with Episode 5, Part 2 of our two-part episode on the 1973 fire at 728 Main Street. So we take a close look at the arson investigation and how the fire forced the city's hand to make several changes in its fire and safety requirements. Special thanks to the Worcester Public Library, the Worcester Police Department, the City of Worcester, and our sponsors for making this possible. Information on the 728 Main Street fire was gathered from multiple resources, including documents from the City of Worcester, reports from the Telegram and Gazette, and more. The Unsolved Worcester podcast music is provided by Tom Lebelzik of the Worcester Jazz Collective. This episode is written and produced by Pat Sargent. Drone footage provided by Ron Scott at New England Sky Pics. Videography and editing by Colin Turner. Sponsorship information announcer Chandler Walsh. This program is supported in part by a grant from the Worcester Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. To find out more about how National Endowment for the Arts grants impact individuals and communities, visit www.arts.gov.